um, let's see who is first. So there was a great question from Ivy Tucker. That was, let me just bring it up. How do you manage the complexity of online content when there are many, many iterations of content that is connected and part of ongoing meme making that may have cultural or political significant, but issues of IP are complex? So I think that's a question really about kind of like the distributed information environments that we now live in and what that means for collection. Anybody fancy a crack?
I might start with that one. That's a really tough one. I think from the NFSA's perspective, so I'll break it into two. The idea about different versions and the changing nature of online content, yeah, really big challenge for us. We're still working through and learning in this environment. Often, we will make decisions about taking in a particular version of material. There will be times when we then make decisions about taking in newer versions, but that decision has to be made. At the moment, we don't have a workflow which, with a distributed collection, we update collections automatically in line with the changing nature of content online. The IP question is also a really good one, and that's obviously a big issue for us, that we work in a complex environment of rights. It's very important to us that we recognise creators and that we work within the IP framework. So yes, with online media, as with all of the audiovisual media we work with, third-party rights are really important. But that nature of the more complex nature of material on online platforms and the complex web of rights takes a lot of unpicking. We are learning in this environment at the moment. I might hand over to see if any of my colleagues can add to that and how they're tackling that.
I might jump in quickly. Yeah, as Jackie said, it's a huge issue. It's a massive issue. And I am conscious that we have some people in the audience here from the State Library of New South Wales who are probably some of the leaders in Australia in connecting social media, where that issue about the interconnectedness is really important. So, for example, there have been many attempts to collect Twitter internationally. And as I said, some of them are local. It's very difficult to do because each individual's perception and experience of Twitter is quite different. And without an understanding of how a group or a person experiences that feed, it's a really difficult thing to emulate. It's partly what I meant around the personalisation. I think that it's extremely difficult. Our best bet at the moment in terms of the direction is to try and get the content in a way where it can be remixed by those users and that piece of engagement, I think, at this point in time. IP for us, at least in that space, the biggest issue isn't just IP, it's also geographic boundary, that so much of the Australian engagement is happening on international platforms and we don't have any legislative capacity to reach out to those platforms, as well as the IP that's owned in those platforms. Complex IP in memes, I would say, is not fundamentally different to some of the issues we've had for a long time with rights. Posters are a nightmare for us because in a poster you often have 5 or 6 different forms of IP. This is a form of publication that we know was intended to be widely viewed and distributed and freely, but they're actually one of the format types we are least able to make publicly accessible because of the complex rights that are inherent in anything that has been produced so collectively. So those things are there, but they're not new.
Okay. Any Craig or Stephen, would you care to weigh in on that, or shall we move on to the next question? Okay, next question it is. All right. So I'm going to pull together like a couple of the questions, I think, which are related to issues of prioritization, bias, who gets to decide what is worth keeping? And this is something that you alluded to in your talk, Alison, but I'd be interested to hear other people's points of view. So so for example, I have a question here from Joanne in terms of, I'm concerned that stories of women are often missing from these collections, which mostly collect moments of time recorded by men. Nicole had a question about how do we keep bias from influencing what is curated, collected. So, so who decides what is worth keeping, and what does that mean? Who wants to have a crack at that?
I'm happy to kick that one off. They're great questions, and it does depend on the approach of the institution. So, for example, the museum is a curated collection. Everything is decided to come into the collection by the curators at the time, and they all do have their own lived experiences, their biases, and the things that they believe are important to the nation. So, whereas Alison talked about some of the catch-all deposit schemes, which is a very different kind of collecting. So it's really hard to sort of lump everything together. But in the context of, a museum and how we collect, I think it's really about building in those practices of critical reflection, of working with communities, not on behalf of communities. It's about talking to people. It's about ensuring, and that will still bring up biases. It will, it's a really complex process, but it's about it's moving away from the idea of being an expert in something, and actually the expertise lies within the community and around and with the nation in the context of national collecting institutions. So it's about being more collaborative in how we collect, and the processes that dictate those collections, and how we understand things like significance, for example, which is a criteria of how things come into the National Museum of Australia. Curators need to write these significance statements, but what does that mean? Whose significance, who have we been talking to get to that point? And I think it's a really complex, there's no one easy way to do that, but it's about ensuring that you apply that critical lens and put a bit of critical distance between yourself and what you're collecting. It's the best way I could articulate that.
Matt, I might just jump in from the National Archives perspective. I mean, for us, it's another take on it, which is, we collect, we hold the material that is assessed as RNA or retained as National Archives, and that work is done very well. It's done very closely with the agencies, really, in terms of those agencies that are creating those records. We're very deliberate that we don't curate our approach. We really do. The agencies working with us work around, what should be retained. These are large series, more often than not. We're very careful that we don't put a filter over that in our approach. So it's for others to then take the collection, interpret the collection, apply those filters, research the collection, pull it out, look back, do all those sorts of things. I mean, just in the COVID space, I mean, the work we've been doing in that is really around the COVID Safe app, and then we're moving into interesting spaces of apps and algorithms and those sorts of things. I mean, it's a complex space to negotiate, but ultimately we're not applying a curatorial filter to the collections. That's for others to do.
Thank you. Any comments from Alison or Jackie?
I might just mention that we're obviously in an unusual position as an archive. We're building an archival collection, but at the same time, when we are curated, it is a curated collection. So I think the challenge is to build a collection that is comprehensive, but also isn't comprehensive. It's not going to be, because we don't have that legal deposit process to assist us in building the collection. We have, for all of the national collecting institutions, obviously there's a structure in which we're legislated with a particular collecting remit. But sitting under that, we all have, for the NFSA, a collecting policy, which is approved by a government-approved board, a government-appointed board. So the challenge for us is to make sure that we have, the policy itself, and then the collecting decisions are representative of the diversity of Australian stories that are complex, and you know, that we're sort of lifting up and taking a sort of you know, there is always that filter, the curatorial filter, but a view of the sort of holistic nature of the collection and how that relates to the sort of the whole experience of the nation. It's a big challenge to do that.
Thanks, Jackie. I've got a question now. I will come to Ellen's question about large and small institutions, and Maureen's questions about time-based media presentation. But I think the question I want to ask is actually about communities and the idea that these institutions, as public institutions, have to serve multiple communities. And the question I want to ask is, and again, this is something that was kind of has been alluded to in terms of, you know, amateur versus professional users of these collections. Which communities do you think are being served well, and which communities more work needs to be done to engage, or there is more opportunity to engage? Anybody want to have a go at that?
I'll start on that one then, since it's a very good question. Actually, it's an excellent question. I think, and I will say that I feel like everybody will have to speak for themselves because we may hit different audiences here. From the perspective of the National Library, we're pretty upfront that we know that we serve an audience well, which is highly educated, which is older, and which has a familiarity and a long-standing engagement with libraries and archives systems and processes. We know that we don't serve well younger people, communities that have English as a second language. In particular, those would be the two areas that we feel like we haven't well served. And there's particular reasons for that around the way that we have a tradition of national cultural institutions working, or certainly the way that the library works. We do feel as if we have a very strong engagement at this point in time with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but we also have an extraordinarily long distance to go to work out how to engage in a way that is mutually beneficial. I think that is not uncommon in the nature of Australia at the moment. But it is important to recognise that despite the points I'm making about the use and engagement with the library by varying different groups, that right now our cultural institutions definitely have, well, the library has a particular skew in who we serve and how it works.
Thank you, Alison. Anybody else care to comment on that? I want to pick on Stephen.
Sure. Okay. I guess it's a similar thing. I mean, but it does vary. I mean, we're very fortunate that we've got an office in every state and territory in Australia, so that the people that engage with us in our, for example, in our Northern Territory office in Darwin, there is a high percentage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that First Nation people that engage through that office. And that's also because our head of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander engagement is based there as well. We also have an office in Perth, which has a high engagement with Asian communities over there because of the records that are held there. That's kind of what's motivating that engagement. I think we're very patchy, you know, to be honest. I think we're not consistent across all our holdings and offices to be as open and as transparent as we can be. We're certainly working towards it. We know it's an issue for us. But, you know, we serve genies or genealogists and, you know, family history researchers and all that. We serve them extremely well. You know, they're regular participants. But when I talk to our consultative forums we have in each of our states, there's not a single young person on any of those fora. You know, we're not getting the voices of, you know, the broader community in terms of what do they want to see, how do they want to use our collections. So, you know, I guess that's my response.
Thank you, Stephen. Craig, Jackie?
Yeah, I'm happy to say something. It's a great question, and of course, I believe every institution, national culturals, all the way down to local, regional institutions, have an enormous amount of work to do to engage particular communities, particularly marginalised communities. To say that there is an endpoint to that is completely untrue, because it's an ongoing iterative process. Diversity is complex, and the diversity of the today will be the mainstream of 100 years, and there'll be new and unimagined diversities moving forward. I think the point to make really is that when you can't see, and Alison sort of touched on this when she was talking about representation, I think it was Alison, when you can't see yourself represented in a cultural space, whether that be a museum, whether that be in the performing arts, whether that be elsewhere, you know, why would you engage? So there's a huge responsibility on the institution and those people working into the institution, not waiting around for those people to come to you with collections, but to actively seek them out and do, you know, real diversity work. And so, you know, if you work in a museum or have talked to a museum professional, they'll say we have a core audience, but that core audience is a choice because we know how to serve them. And I think it's important for us to learn how to serve other people. And it's not necessarily going to be in the same way that we know how to do it. And we're going to have to open our minds to different ways of thinking, which is happening, you know, in the First Nations space, for sure, in a much greater way than other spaces. But again, as Alison said, huge amount of work to do still there.
I might just mention that in a practical sense, yes, we do, as the group of our institutions work with across the nation. So the National Library coordinates the Community Heritage Grants Program, which both the Archives and Museum and NFSA contribute to, which is around working with small galleries, libraries, archives, museums, community heritage groups to preserve their collections and undertake significance assessments. So it's a practical way in which we are supporting smaller organisations. For the NFSA, one of the areas, we work with a number of organisations on our collection development activities, but an area in which we see we really have a role is on digitisation of audiovisual material. And I know that particularly, you know, the library and the archives are doing the same in helping to both work on skills sharing and some of the technological sort of challenges that a lot of institutions are facing. And we think, you know, if we as a big institution, relatively speaking, are struggling with these, I can only imagine that our smaller cousins are really grappling with the challenge of digitising and then making things available in digital form.
On the local groups, I'll just say briefly, I think one of the biggest things for me that I've seen change in the last 15 years in the cultural institution sector is that the belief that the best way forward is to have everything in-house is really dissipated. The concept of the national distributed collection has become a much more real thing. And that's partly because all of us are overwhelmed with collection offers. You know, I should say too, National Library comprehensive collection was a concept I wanted to talk about. We have selective collecting and curated collecting. You need both as well. But we are all overwhelmed. The part for me of the most exciting, I'd sort of finished on this, elements of digital and the future is that it no longer matters so much where something is held. And that means we have a responsibility to support local community collecting. Many things should be held in local communities or by communities that are not even geographic based, but those things have significance and process in that community. We can provide a whole lot of access and understanding and discussion and process to that doesn't have to be now. So I do think there's much stronger collaboration between the big institutions and the small institutions than we've seen for some time in that space. Certainly initiatives like the community heritage grants are really important ways of understanding and strengthening as they move forward. There's a really positive trajectory there.
Thanks, Alison. I think that actually at least partially answers Ellen's question, which is, do large cultural institutions work with smaller local cultural institutions to reach other communities. And also Louise Kerham's question, which is, are you exploring broker relationships with communities where the NCI support communities own collecting practices rather than trying to duplicate it or capture it later on? So both of those questions seem to be kind of touching on what you've just alluded to, Alison. Any other comments around those two topics from the rest of the speakers?
I think just quickly, you'll also find that a lot of state institutions have programs to support the development of regional and remote institutions in their, collecting activities, in establishing practices and policies. I used to work in South Australia at the History Trust of South Australia, and we definitely had a program of supporting over 300 community museums and history groups in developing their practice, and a lot of those were volunteer run, or maybe one person worked there 1 day a week, so there is a lot of collaboration happening. And so that in the context of the National Museum, we're collaborating with smaller museums in slightly different ways, through travelling exhibition programs, through working with them to find out what they need and want from a national cultural institution in the context of being a museum rather than an archive. So yeah, there's lots of, complex and interesting relationships that emerge.
Okay, thank you, Craig. And whilst I've got you here, Maureen Henninger has a question. Maureen's associated with UTS, and Alison might remember her. So Maureen's question is, what are current thoughts on the preservation of time-based media art?
Was that for me?
That's a question for Craig or anyone else.
It's definitely not my area, but I do know there's from a conservation perspective, there's a huge amount of work happening in that space in terms of collecting time-based media art. And I think there's an amazing person who can't remember their name right now, but at New South Wales, who's very much an expert in that field. So there is work happening, but I couldn't necessarily speak to it.
And I would somewhat cynically say, from the National Archives perspective, thank goodness for the 20-year rule. Don't think about it for 20 years. I am being frivolous.
We won't hold it against you, Stephen. We'll delete that from the recording. Right, last orders for questions. Okay, everybody's gone quiet. So this has been a fantastic session. Thank you very much to each of our four speakers. Are there any final thoughts that you would care to share before we say goodbye? Stephen.
Look, no, except I think the discussion is an ongoing one for all our institutions, really, and that there's, as we've all said, there's plenty more work to do in the space, and we all have a role to play in it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Craig.
Just that, while we've been talking about the role of the national cultural institutions here, just to say that actually it is a collective, this kind of work is a collective responsibility, so you're all on the hook too. And, please contribute and get in touch and collaborate with us. I'm sure we'll all be open to it.
Thank you, Craig. It takes a nation to collect a nation. Jackie.
And that directly follows on from what Craig was saying. I was going to say what has been obvious to me tonight is how connected our activities are across the four institutions we're representing, that the NCIs operate really as a college of institutions and reference each other constantly.
Thank you, Jackie. And Alison.
Yes, it's been a fantastic panel, and I feel like we've raised more questions than we've answered, but that's what working in the sector is like. For everybody here, I will quickly do a quick answer to Katrina, who asked a question about deepfakes and hasn't had an answer. The answer is yes. Yes, we are interested in collecting deepfakes. I think I could say that for all of my colleagues across the table. And the only other thing I'll do to give a plug to something I forgot to say is that I also feel like the oral history programs, and this is partly to Joanne's question about women, is really important for filling those gaps between what is created in a documentary record. Almost all the institutions here tonight collect some form of oral history. We don't have IATSIS, which is a really important institution and has really rich collections. But those are the mechanisms that we also need to use to fill in the gaps and to move the process forward. So yes, thank you very much. And I agree with Craig, this is a collective responsibility and engagement.
Thank you so much to our presenters. And thank you so much to our participants as well, for taking the time to be here tonight. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.